So hello everybody, we are going to talk about paragraph 555, the third great paragraph introducing the concept of the absolute spirit. And it's interesting that Hegel doesn't yet talk about art, which is the first stage of the development of absolute spirit, but he continues talking about religion actually. And that's what we'll find in paragraph 555, a very difficult passage, and I don't want to talk at length about it, but I will try to present it to the best of my ability. Of course, we're going to start with the German text, and then we'll see if we can get some first idea of what it means. Then we go to the English translation, and then we go to the Volta, the flow of the argument way of showing the whole thing, so that you can get an image of a mental image of the structure of the whole paragraph. So quite an interesting but also quite a difficult text, which concludes our first introduction to the concept of absolute spirit. So after this video we will going to talk about art, the difference between romantic art. Hegel calls the whole history of art till his day romantic art, and he predicts the end of art. That is to say, the end of art as a way of manifesting the absolute spirit. Talk about that next time, but let's first dive into this very difficult text. First, the German original. So here it is, paragraph 555. Das subjektive Bewusstsein des absoluten Geistes ist wesentlich in sich Prozess, dessen unmittelbare und substanzielle Einheit der Glaube in dem Zeugnis des Geistes als die Gewissheit von der objektiven Wahrheit ist. It's like stenography, yeah? There's not one superfluous word in this sentence. Let's try to break it up a little bit. So subjective consciousness of absolute spirit. Remember that Ivana and I talked about the relationship between individual consciousness and the absolute. Here it's called the subjective consciousness of absolute spirit. Human beings have some kind of idea, a consciousness, an awareness of what absolute spirit means. But Hegel says that is not a static kind of consciousness. It's not a single grasp of the mind, but it's essentially, wesentlich, in sich, within itself, it's a process. A process that has a development, it's a movement of the mind. And that's the only way that this subjective consciousness can exist, as something that develops over time. Not a static consciousness, because first and foremost, the absolute spirit is not a static thing, something that develops over time and in history, but the same thing happens in our own lives, in our own subjective consciousness. It's a process. Now, the immediate and substantial unit is, so this process has an immediate and substantial unity. That is to say, this connection between our consciousness and absolute spirit is immediate. There's nothing in between, a typical Protestant idea. There's no priest functioning between myself and God. And it's also substantial, a substantial unity. The absolute spirit is not something that is merely transcending myself. It's not like in unhappy consciousness, that the object is totally removed from my consciousness, but it's something that I receive within myself, and at the same time I must understand myself to be included in, cherished by, loved by, however you want to call it in theological terms, by this absolute spirit. So it's substantial unity. It's actually the same. I'm part of the deity is within me, etc. It's basically a consciousness that is an awareness of this unity. So faith, what we call faith, is within the testimony of the Spirit. That's the way the Spirit actually manifests itself. It gives a testimony of itself. And how does that function? It's the certainty of objective truth. That's how faith works. That doesn't mean that faith is the highest way to recognize and understand absolute truth, but it's a certainty of objective truth. So it's still divided within itself between subjectivity and objectivity. Objective truth, to understand, to believe that God is the absolute truth. That is the way that faith expresses the absolute spirit. That is the way we can see that this subjective consciousness actually functions. Faith is the mode of subjective consciousness. Okay, let's go to the second sentence now. You see how long that one is. Der Glaube, so he's going to explain now more about this concept of faith. Der Glaube, zugleich diese unmittelbare Einheit und sie als das Verhältnis jener unterschiedlichen Bestimmungen enthaltend, ist in der Andacht, dem impliziten oder expliziteren Kultus, in den Prozess übergegangen, den Gegensatz zur geistigen Befreiung aufzuheben, durch diese Vermittlung jene erste Gewissheit zu bewähren und die konkrete Bestimmung derselben, nämlich die Versöhnung, die Wirklichkeit des Geistes zu gewinnen. Okay, there we go. So faith is at the same time, zugleich, this immediate unity between subjective consciousness and the absolute. And also within faith, we have this relationship between these different determinations. That is also within faith. So faith is, on the one hand, this immediate unity, this immediate connection with the absolute. It's also, it also contains a notion of, a consciousness of the difference between the two. There is, after all, such a thing as the theological difference. That's basically, no matter how this unity in consciousness actually works, but it's basically the understanding, the awareness that there is a difference between subjective consciousness and the absolute itself. And that is something, that is not something that we can say about faith from the outside, but it's maintained within faith itself. Now, this faith that has these both elements, unity and awareness of difference, is in der Andacht. So that is in the piety, the worship mode of consciousness. It's in the implicit or more explicit cult. Cult means all the actions, all the symbols that we use in a church service, for instance, but also symbols that you can have at home. Practice, the practice of your religion at home. Maybe there is an hour of prayer before you start the day. Maybe there is prayer at the dinner table. Maybe there, in church, you will encounter various symbols and colors and images on the wall. That's an implicit cult would be something like a way of thinking and doing things. The more explicit cult would be the symbols and the service, which has a set and uniform way of doing things, and like the Eucharist, like a prayer meeting. That's what Hegel means by the cult. So now it has become process. It's process. Faith is a process. It's not simply this static consciousness. It's not simply the cult, but because of the cult, there is indeed a process. You go into a church service, it has a start and a finish. It has definite stages going towards the end. So in that sense, there is a process. There's a process within faith itself also. The opposition that is still there, das Verhältnis jener unterschiedlichen Bestimmungen, and it's the opposition between subjective consciousness and absolute spirit, has to become, and in this process it's actually going there, to a spiritual liberation. That is what the cult should do. That is what this process is all about. A spiritual liberation. A liberation from what? Well, from this element of unhappy consciousness, I would argue, this element of putting the absolute on the other side of myself, being estranged from the absolute. This liberation liberates the unity of consciousness and the absolute by the removal, or at least the Aufhebung, specific technical term, meaning that you transcend the opposition, you transcend the contradiction, to some kind of spiritual liberation. And only when you do that, there is this mediation going on, which actually reestablishes the first certainty. It shows its validity, its truth, bewähren. It's kept by that. So in the process of the cult, in which the contradiction is so clear, in which there is a Verhältnis, a relationship with something outside of your consciousness, you have to go through all of that to reestablish the first certainty. What is the first certainty? That's die Gewissheit von der objektiven Wahrheit, so the certainty of the objective truth in absolute spirit. The more concrete determinacy of this first certainty is the reconciliation between my subjective consciousness and absolute spirit. There is reconciliation. There is no harmful, no threatening distinction, or, well, there is a distinction, but there is no opposition, there's no contradiction. And that is how ultimately, through this religious reconciliation, we ultimately gain the reality of the spirit. The reality of the spirit, according to Hegel, is the presence of the spirit within human beings, within humanity as a whole, establishing a relationship with the absolute spirit. That's the religious part of it. But understanding goes further than that. Philosophy will understand that this overcoming of the contradiction between humanity and God actually means that everything is within God, or that everything is the absolute. But that is the difficulty that lies ahead still when we reach the third stage of everything. And the absolute spirit has philosophy. Okay, let's take a look now at the English translation. So here we have the English translation. The subjective consciousness of the absolute spirit is essentially and intrinsically a process, the immediate substantial unity of which is the belief. So he's not saying faith, but the belief. There's a problem here. There's Glauben is both. Glauben in German means both belief and faith. There's a difference between the two. Belief is a word that refers to my state of consciousness. Faith signifies a connection, a relationship between my belief and the thing that I trust in. And so faith has something to do with being faithful, having this connection of trust. Now, the translator here chooses for belief, but you have to understand that the original says Glauben. That's why it's so important to read the original and not just the translation. Otherwise, you would say the belief is only the subjective element. And it is not so much the belief in the witness of the spirit as the certainty of objective truth. But okay, let's take the translation as our starting point. So faith and belief is the witness of the Spirit. The Spirit speaks to our spirit. There's a direct communication. God is Spirit, and whoever wants to worship Him has to worship Him in spirit and in truth. That's a quotation from the Gospel of John, and I think that was an important idea in Hegel's mind. So the Spirit gives a witness of itself, which resounds, which is present within our faith and belief as the certainty of objective truth. So belief or faith is this immediate unity. It has in itself a reciprocal dependence of these different terms. I don't like that translation, but okay. So in devotion, in the cult, in worship, it passes over into a process of leaving behind the contrast or the contradiction, and it becomes spiritual liberation. And ultimately, through this process, which happens in religion, for Hegel, Protestant religion, we reach the actuality of the Spirit. So what is the actuality of the Spirit? Die Wirklichkeit des Geistes. That is present within the belief system, the faith of the congregation, actually, not just the individual, but the congregation as a whole, of which then you and I can be a part. And then we experience this as a process within the cult, process even in our own consciousness. Now let's take a look at the phota, the flow of the argument form of this, and I will make it a little bit bigger and better to see. Let's go here. So the subjective consciousness of the Absolute Spirit is what? I would have to do it like this. And I have to move this aside. Why do I do that? I refer to one of my first videos on this section of the Absolute Spirit to explain what the phota is. So the subjective consciousness of the Absolute Spirit, that is what we want to talk about. And that subjective consciousness is faith or belief, and it's explained in the second part. You see how it works. So first statement, it's a process. This process has a unity, and that unity is expressed in the witness of the Spirit. I accept the witness, the testimony of the Spirit, and in my consciousness, that is the certainty of objective truth. Belief or faith, as in devotion, two things. It's in devotion into the process of authenticating, bewähren in German, authenticating that first certainty by this intermediation, of gaining its concrete determination, that is reconciliation, and that is actually the actuality of the Spirit. So basically he is saying that faith or belief expresses itself in devotion, and in that devotion, the actuality of the Spirit comes to the foreground, becomes a reality, something that I can experience as a subjective consciousness, because the contradiction has been transcended. I am now aware of this, the truth of my first certainty. First certainty is the connection. The second element in consciousness is the distinction and the contradiction. And then in the process of the cult, in the process of my developing consciousness, I regain this experience of the unity of both, and that experience of the unity is the actuality of the Spirit. Okay, let's try to figure out what that means in a more practical sense. Okay, what can we say about this from a more, let's say, neutral perspective? So what is Hegel actually arguing? Well, first of all, faith, belief, notwithstanding your personal view or what your personal belief may be, that's not so important. The main thing is that in something like belief or faith, there is a manifestation of the Absolute Spirit. Even if you're not part of a congregation, if you're not a Christian, if you're not a Jew or a Muslim, you could take this seriously as a philosopher. And why is that? Because it's an historical reality, right? We have congregations, we have church history, we have churches, we have people that have determined themselves, are determined by their personal faith and belief experiences. So Hegel says, well, no matter how you think about that, that is a manifestation in history of the Absolute Spirit. And why is that the case? Because in a congregation, there is an element of worship, Andacht. There is a process that people go through. And if you look at it from the outside as a philosopher, you actually see this consciousness that is at the same time a consciousness of the unity with the Absolute and a consciousness of the distinction or contradiction with the Absolute. You see how that transforms itself through the concept of redemption or reconciliation into a consciousness that actually demonstrates the first step in that consciousness, which is the consciousness of the unity. I am the Absolute, and I'm distinct from the Absolute. That's the position of religion. The Absolute is within me, and I'm still not the same as the Spirit in me. Hegel's thinking is about that structure. It's about the structure of a religious consciousness, because it says something about the way that humanity, and I might add mainly the majority of human beings, how they relate to the Absolute. They don't do that as philosophers, but they do that as religious people. And then there's a lot of consequences. I mean, there are very interesting things to say about the concept, for instance, of a congregation. That's a spiritual community, not a national community, not a simple social community. There's something transcendent to that kind of a community. It's not about each other when we are in church, for instance. It's not about producing something or, let's say, exercising an idea of righteousness or whatever. It's only about the experience of being unified. For instance, in the cult, when we sing psalms together, to be unified in focusing ourselves, focusing our attention to the Absolute that has developed over time or that has manifested itself in history. Hegel is thinking about that kind of a structure, and he praises the Protestant religion because within its cult there is this emphasis on reconciliation, to go beyond my personal identity, to leave behind a sense of guilt and brokenness and the disparity between myself and the Absolute in any moral sense, for instance, and achieving this kind of almost mystical unity with the Absolute. Not really mystical, because I'm not leaving my thinking behind. It's not about an intuitive unity or connection. It's about a thinking connection. The Absolute has to be there somehow. The Absolute is the precondition of everything finite existing. The Absolute is actually that which demonstrates itself within my own subjective consciousness. Not in the way Schleiermacher thought it is doing, but in the more reflective and analytical way that Hegel describes it. What are consequences then for us in practice? Well, Hegel has drawn this conclusion of all of this. If you are a philosopher, you shouldn't be far away from theology and the congregation. Sounds a bit silly and simple, maybe. But when you want to practice philosophy as an attitude, it's a good thing to experience the Absolute Spirit also in the form of a congregation, in the form of this universal worship. You might not agree with that. It doesn't matter, because Hegel doesn't focus on the fact that you need to do that. He focuses on the fact that you need to understand that. You need to understand that that is a important structure that we have in our world. That's it for now. Maybe this Thursday I will be speaking about the same topic. I don't know yet. You know, I improvise our Thursday live sessions. But if you have any questions about this topic, or you want to contradict or add to what I'm saying, please do so, and we'll come back to it later. Thanks for listening today, and have a good week, and hope to see you on Thursday.